Ladies and gentlemen, this is what it all comes down to.
Now, we Baptists cherish our doctrinal inheritance. I want to say this without stutter. We are a people of the book.
Payday someday had become a reality in Jezebel's life.
My brother, if the hierarchical approach to the scriptures dominates our institutions and our denomination, there will be no missionaries to hurt. They will cease to exist.
I have no other argument. I need no other plea. It is enough that Jesus died and that he died for me.
Welcome back to the Baptist Directory. I'm Dr. Michael Schultz, and on today's episode we are going to be looking into the person of Alexander MacLaren. Alexander MacLaren was born on the 11th of February 1826 and died on the 5th of May 1910. Now, Alexander MacLaren is a figure that modern Baptists should know for several reasons. First and foremost, I believe modern Baptists should know him because he was an exemplary Christian. Now, that's not to say that he was without fault, but by examining his life, I find him to be very inspiring. And secondly, modern Baptists should know him because he was a model preacher. With the recent re-emphasis on expository preaching, what manner of crime is it that Baptists have never heard of the one who was known for more than a century as the Prince of Expositors? And third, modern Baptists should know him because of the example his life sets for those in the ministry, both with positive and negative purposes. Now, as we begin, allow me to give you just a few of the accolades by which you might come to understand the magnitude of the man. Alexander MacLaren was twice elected president of the Baptist Union of Great Britain, which is a national, or you might say international, association of Baptists. During his second presidency, he represented the Union during a private meeting with King Edward VII. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. He was also a major force in the foundation of the Baptist World Alliance, which later became the largest worldwide association of Baptists, and he was also elected to be its first president in 1905. In his almost 60 years as a pastor, he served only two churches, one a rather small church in Southampton for 12 years, and the other a very large church in Manchester for 45 years. He achieved a bachelor's degree with highest honors, having studied Latin, Hebrew, and Greek at Stepney College, now part of London University. As a student, he won awards for scriptural examinations, and in 1877 he was awarded his first Doctor of Divinity from Edinburgh University, becoming the first nonconformist to ever receive such an honor. In 1902, Victoria University in Manchester awarded him a Doctor of Letters, which was conveyed on him in person by the future King George V. And on the 23rd of April, 1907, he was awarded a final Doctor of Divinity from the University of Glasgow. Finally, after declining a professorship in Hebrew at Regent's Park College of Oxford, as well as a professorship of homiletics at the University of Chicago in the United States, he was made the governor of the Owens College and the Ryland Library at Manchester University, and oversaw much of the development of the theological faculty at that institution. Beyond simply speaking of the accomplishments that he had in his life, let me tell you a few quotes from individuals who knew him or were well read in his works, to give you an idea of how others felt about him. J. Edward Roberts, who was his successor at Union Chapel, the church that he pastored for 45 years, said of him, "He may seem remote and reserved to the newspaper correspondent, but his personal friends find him delightfully accessible and free. He is a sparkling conversationalist. Reclining in his armchair with a smoking cap and a smoking pipe to take off the sense of difference between him and oneself, he will tell capital stories with eminable skill, or will strike up keen epigrammatic sayings about current events, or will laugh at your own stories, or will acquiesce in your rugged expressions of truth. Take a difficulty to him as a tale of woe, and he is the tenderest of sympathizers and the wisest of counselors." Sir George Reed, who was commissioned to paint a portrait of Dr. MacLaren, wrote, "His conversation was delightful, full of interest and animation. There was nothing of the ecclesiastic about him, and he had the saving grace of humor, which so few preachers have, to their great loss, if I may venture to say so. When the humorous or ridiculous side of a thing cropped up, his appreciation of it was instantaneous. He passed time in the enjoyment of a pipe. He, Dr. MacLaren, preferred a heavy clay one, a church warden, I think they call it, a supply of which was kept in a jar on the top of the bookcase in the studio. Dr. A. Taylor Inez once wrote, "Was there ever an old face so young? His face was like a poet, an intense hate of hate, a scorn of scorn, and a love of love. He missed no occasion for courtesy, however transient. Above all, he made no quick response of feeling to any of the works, ways, hopes, or destinies of all whom he loved, which was everyone whom he ever knew." F.B. Meyer wrote of him, "As an expository preacher, none of them equaled MacLaren of Manchester, and no other sermons were so widely read around the world. Dr. MacLaren is said with truth to have changed the whole style of the British pulpit and to have influenced it more than any of his predecessors." Lee Eckloy wrote, "To this day he is one of those preacher scholars whom we should not read too early in our preparation, lest we find ourselves unable to think for ourselves." Alexander Gordon said, "He had a degree of personal magnetism and pulpit power that placed him above all rivalry." Warren Wiersbe wrote, "Alexander MacLaren was one of the greatest preachers of the 19th century, the same era that gave us Charles H. Spurgeon, R.W. Dale, Joseph Parker, and Henry Liddon. The difference between he and these was that he did more by doing less." Joseph Parker wrote of him, "There is no greater preacher than Alexander MacLaren in the English-speaking pulpit. This man is a prophet, and you must either listen and swallow or flee." John C. Carlyle, who was a biographer of MacLaren, wrote, "Dr. MacLaren stands among the foremost of the world's preachers. Baptists have been rich in great men, but no greater expositor has been given to their pulpits than Alexander MacLaren. He was the most influential preacher of his age, but his chief concern was that he should present the gospel as clearly as he could." W. Robertson Nichol wrote, "A man who reads one of MacLaren's sermons must either take his outline of the text or take another text. His natural gifts were extraordinary. Perhaps no preacher has ever plowed so straight and sharp a furrow across the field of life, never looking aside, never turning back. He was out of sight the most brilliant man all around we ever knew. In any company where he sat, he was the head of the table. Before you knew he was a prophet, you were sure he was a king. He might have been anything, a soldier, a politician, a man of letters, or a man of science, and in any profession he would have taken the lead. He mastered any subject, and yet was mastered by Christ. If anyone was ever apprehended by Christ Jesus in early years, it was Alexander MacLaren. We know that in him as much power was kept back as was brought out. We shall not see his like again." James Stewart, another biographer, wrote of him, "In whatever company he was present, his supremacy was instinctively felt. He was a king of men. He was what Dr. John Brown called a solar man, a sun with its attendant planets. His sermons have, we believe, had a wider circulation than those of any other preacher, with the one exception being Mr. Spurgeon. And yet he scarcely wrote, and would never have published his own sermons had they not been, in a sense, wrung out of him." Jimmy Carter wrote of him, "MacLaren was without peer. When it comes to preaching what the Bible actually says, which I hope you would agree is the real job of the preacher, MacLaren stands at the head of the class among preachers of the entire English language." So who was he? Alexander MacLaren came from a long line of Scotsmen and women who were proud to be Scottish in every way, including especially their allegiance to the Church of Scotland. Alexander's father, David MacLaren, was raised in the city of Perth by his parents to be a minister in the Church of Scotland. So en route to this goal, David began attending Glasgow College, which is now the University of Glasgow. At that time, there was a revival breaking out in Scotland, extending much of what is known today as the Second Great Awakening into Scottish territory. The revival was widespread, but two specific religious men with wealthy families, Mr. Robert and James Haldane, imitated what George Whitefield had done in London and their own areas, specifically Glasgow, Dundee, Perth, Thurso, Wick, Edinburgh, and Elgin. Now, this movement's impact on Glasgow greatly affected David MacLaren, who, as a result, left the Church of Scotland, much to the displeasure of his parents, and joined the Congregational Church of Glasgow under Dr. Ralph Wardlaw. At this church, he soon fell in love with one of the deacon's daughters, Miss Mary Wingate. Her father had been excluded from the Cameronian Fellowship for the crime of going to hear a missionary sermon by Dr. David Brogue. And by the way, not that it has anything to do with this story, but if you have never heard of the Cameronian Covenanters, have a look into that little era of history. What an interesting alternative history could have been in the United Kingdom had they succeeded in their ambitions. Mary Wingate was described as being a woman of strong and saintly character, whose patient fortitude, calm and wisdom, and changeless love were her husband's treasure for many years of mingled sunshine and storm, and who remained fresh and fragrant to her children through the end of her life. At the age of 40, David MacLaren and about 40 other individuals in Dr. Wardlaw's church came to Credo Baptist convictions upon his preaching on the household baptisms of the book of Acts. Consequently, MacLaren and Mr. James Buchan started their own church, which later became known as the Scotch Baptist Church of George Street. And thus it was, by the time Alexander MacLaren was born, his father was a bivocational lay elder in one of the few Scotch Baptist churches in the United Kingdom. David and Mary had at least 6 children together. Their oldest boy died very early on. The next oldest boy, John Wingate, lived into his 60s. 2 of their daughters, Elizabeth Renshaw and Jane MacLaren, lived past the age of 90. One daughter, Christina Morrison, died at the age of 54. And the youngest of all of their children, a little boy by the name of Alec, who was younger than the others by at least 5 or 6 years, lived to be 84. When young Alec, or Alexander as we know him, was 10 years old, his father was called upon by the South Australian Company to go to Australia and form a branch of their business in the relatively new colony. Up to that time, Britain had used Australia almost exclusively as a penal colony, but gold rushes and agricultural discoveries raised the financial value of the island continent, leading to businesses scrambling to expand into the new land. So David left Scotland for Australia in October of 1836, waiting 2 months for a favorable wind. Mind you, this is in the day of sailboats. Then spending 4 more months at sea, finally arriving at Kangaroo Island. Yes, Kangaroo Island, which was a brand new colony, only started that July under the South Australia Act of 1834. He would go on to be one of the founders of the city of Adelaide, which to this day is the capital and most populous city in South Australia. One of his first acts upon arrival was, aside from the duties of his job that he'd actually come for, was to establish a Baptist church in the city. Back at home, young Alexander was developing into a very studious but shy young boy. His family continued to have family worship every afternoon throughout the week, even in the absence of his father, and he used the term rigidly puritanical to describe his upbringing. But he made very clear that he didn't have any unhappiness about it, saying instead that he, quote, regarded it with gratitude and pleasure. Even though he had what today would be considered a very stern and strict childhood, there were still moments of joy that led to later quirks and habits in Alexander as an adult. For example, Alexander had a tendency toward imagination, and once, when exploring his attic, he discovered an old military cloak as well as a helmet and an old sword. He would regularly put them on, not so much as to play war games, but simply to wear them while doing other menial tasks. Once, while studying for school, his mother caught him wearing the gear and reprimanded him for it, but he explained that he wasn't playing war, he simply felt that wearing the gear helped him study. His mother, while somewhat perplexed by that, allowed it. He became a very intelligent young man. He began to read Philip Doddridge's Rise and Progress of Religion and the Soul, but he found religious books, although they were appreciated, to be rather unconvincing. His father was a thoroughgoing Calvinist, and Alexander wrestled with the doctrine of election. But one week he attended a revival held by W. Lindsay Alexander. MacLaren doesn't speak of his reflections on Dr. Alexander specifically, but he does note that one night a guest preacher arose, a man by the name of David Russell. He provoked the crowd with a call, Before you rise off of your seats, you might be saved for all time and eternity." MacLaren, in hearing this, says, "I felt hope beginning to rise in my mind." Where he had previously wondered whether he was elect or not, Reverend Russell's open invitation gave him hope that he had not previously considered available to just anyone. MacLaren demanded in later years that any biography of him ever written must include the name of Reverend David Russell, because, as he said, "He is credited with quickening the early religious impressions I had into living faith and surrender. To him I owe so much wise and affectionate counsel in my boyish years." He soon after made his profession of faith and asked to be baptized at the Hope Street Baptist Church where he had attended while his father was away. He was baptized on either the 7th or the 17th of May, 1840, by Dr. James Paterson. During this same time period, Alexander had begun studying at Glasgow College in 1838 to master Latin and Greek, but his family moved roughly 50 miles east to Edinburgh before he could finish the program. The elder MacLaren, having worked for 4 years in Australia, returned to the United Kingdom in 1840. He left behind several churches that he had started, as well as the MacLaren Wharf, which was named after him, and the MacLaren Vale, which was also named after him. Upon his return, David reconnected with his family to find that they and a great number of the 180 members of his church had moved to Edinburgh to unite the George Street Baptist with the Portland Street Baptist and one other church that was under William Sheriff. These three churches, representing a combined 225 members, formed the John Street Scotch Baptist Church in Edinburgh in 1841. And it was in this church that Alexander would spend the rest of his adolescence. As he considered how to move forward with his education, his father began to prompt him toward the ministry. At one point, David took him to see Reverend Charles Spurgeon, a personal pastor friend. After a brief meeting, David asked Spurgeon, "Do you think the lad would make a minister?" Spurgeon pondered for a moment before saying, "Perhaps he might." After this, Alexander began paying close attention to his father's habits as a pastor. He remembered well into his elder years how his father would tell him about having many business anxieties, but he heard him say that when he began his preparations for Sabbath on Saturday afternoon, all of his troubles passed from his mind and left him undisturbed until Monday morning when the fight was renewed. Alexander also recalled his father's preaching rather well as an adult. He wrote, "His ministry was marked by much intellectual vigor and clearness. It was richly scriptural, expository, and instructive, and withal earnestly evangelistic. Its keynote was, 'That which we have seen with our eyes and our hands have handled of the word of life, declare we unto you.' I was too young to form a judgment of my father's sermons, but not too young to receive an impression which has powerfully influenced me in my own work and abides with me still." With these sorts of encouragements, Alexander said that he could not ever recall having had any hesitation as to being a minister, saying instead, "It must have simply been taken for granted by my father and mother and myself. It just had to be." It could also be noted that despite his parents' inclination towards puritanicalism, MacLaren said he never in his entire life remembered a dreary Sunday growing up. His father always enjoyed Sundays, and one would imagine that this set a healthy precedent for him in desiring to become a minister. In 1842, Alexander chose to return to school, having enjoyed the 2 intervening years as essentially an apprentice under his father at the John Street Scotch Baptist Church of Edinburgh. With the doors of Oxford and Cambridge being closed to nonconformists in those days, his next best option was to study at the Baptist College at Stepney. Stepney College, which is now Regent's Park at Oxford, had been incorporated with the London University and had a very good reputation. So Alexander took and passed the entrance examinations, beginning studies toward his B.A. in fall of 1842. Rather than continuing his studies in Latin and Greek, he chose to enter an honors program in Greek and Hebrew, specifically working to master the original languages of the Bible. Although he'd preferred to go to Oxford or Cambridge, his interest in languages proved best served at Stepney, because in 1844, the college received a new president in Dr. Benjamin Davies, one of the world's greatest Hebraists and the author of a very well-regarded Hebrew grammar and Hebrew lexicon. In the 2 years that Dr. Davies oversaw MacLaren's original language studies, he did master Hebrew. and Greek, and Latin. As a junior at Stepney, he had developed a practice that he would maintain for the rest of his life, spending a half an hour every morning reading a chapter of the Old Testament and a chapter of the New Testament in the Hebrew and the Greek, purely for devotional purposes. He was so convinced of the value of this practice that he would later teach his own students, "Unless you become competent students of the original languages, you will be living to expound a book that you cannot read." He also greatly benefited from the homiletical courses he took under Dr. Thomas Binney. Dr. Binney taught MacLaren not to read sermons, but to speak them, and to speak carefully and with a polished manner, saying, "Stand on your hind legs and talk." MacLaren himself said that his two favorite preachers of all time to listen to were Thomas Binney and Henry Melville, so it's fair to assume that Binney is in no small part the reason MacLaren rarely relied on notes, oftentimes not writing hardly any at all. As a matter of fact, there's a funny instance in one of his sermons to a ministerial association where he was scandalized because he got up and told a bunch of young preachers, "The first thing you need to do before you get behind a pulpit is burn your manuscript notes." It was said of him in later life that the finest sentences in his sermons were never found in his notes. He spoke much better English than he could write, but he commanded words like an emperor and a magician. His speaking was so lofty, we often didn't know whether he was speaking or singing. No living man could come within measurable distance of his speeches, and yet it was all effortless. At the age of 17, MacLaren was asked to come and preach his first sermon ever at the Baptist Church on Duncan Street in Edinburgh, a church constructed by James Haldane, by the way. MacLaren's entire family came to hear his first sermon, and upon leaving, his uncle remarked, "It was the most remarkable thing from beginning to end." Now, although MacLaren had met all of the requirements and was intellectually equal to or superior to any of his classmates, as well as being theologically aligned with all the expectations, including a consistent Calvinism, he was eloquent in speech beyond many of those already in pulpits. All of this played no part in the examination committee at Stepney's College decision to not ordain him. The reason that they gave for refusing to ordain him was, "He looks too much like a little boy." Although he was nearing 18 years old, he was a tall, thin, shy, silent young man with a soft face that made it hard to convince anyone that he was even 16 years old. Reverend Samuel Green served on the committee that accepted MacLaren into the school, and he was so impressed that he wrote to his own son, who was also a student at the time, "Today we have accepted a young scholar who will cut you all out, Sam." But even Reverend Green commented at one point that he would not even permit MacLaren to preach in public until he was, quote, "more elderly looking." So upon graduating with his Bachelor of Arts in October of 1845, he immediately enrolled in the Master of Arts program, since pastoring was evidently not an option for him yet. He did continue doing itinerant preaching, though, and barely a month later, on the 16th of November 1845, he was asked to come and preach at Portland Chapel in Southampton. As the church was without a pastor, they invited him to continue as their ongoing pulpit supply for 3 months, and he agreed. At the end of the 3 months, the deacons of the church asked him to consider becoming their pastor. MacLaren asked them to allow him to continue preaching on the basis that they were on for at least another year, just to make sure that they were certain they wanted him to be their pastor. This would also let him continue to make progress on his Master of Arts without shutting that door permanently to accept the pastorate at Portland. Now, during this time, many of his college advisors advised against this position. First of all, most expected him to go well beyond his master's degree. The present situation would see him not even achieve the master's degree. Secondly, the church was in a very rural area and was in quite terrible shape. Although the sanctuary was fit to hold 800 people, the present membership of the congregation was only numbered at 20 souls. The church was in £200 sterling of debt and required £60 sterling immediately to make repairs to the sanctuary that could not be postponed or ignored. As if it needs to be said, the congregation was not composed of wealthy members. The church had, perhaps overly ambitiously, offered a salary of about £60 per year, which would equate to £6,000 of modern British money, or $8,100 per year in American dollars. But in a letter from a member of the era, we discover that MacLaren had even counter-proposed a bright way out of the debt difficulty by offering to come without any salary at all until all the liabilities were paid. The member notes that he believed that his father could and would support him and see him through it without salary. With a constitution of such resolve, it was beyond question MacLaren was going to take the job. So, having graduated from Stepney College with his Bachelor of Arts in Greek and Hebrew with honors, and having won awards for scriptural examinations, on the 28th of June, 1846, the 20-year-old Alexander MacLaren was ordained to the gospel ministry and withdrew from Stepney's Master of Arts College, and formally became the pastor of the dying church called Portland Chapel in Southampton. Portland Chapel at Southampton was only in its 6th year of operation when the 20-year-old Alexander MacLaren became its pastor. It was planted in 1840 by Dr. John Pulsford, who was a very highly regarded theologian, but after only 3 years there, left the church in a very poor standing. Evidently, as noted by many who knew him and the situation, he, quote, unfortunately lacked the appropriate skills to effectively run or lead a church. When Pulsford left the church, they were deep in debt from the cost of constructing their chapel. The succeeding pastor, whose name has mercifully been stricken from all historical records, was there for 2 years from 1843 to 1845, and is described as being, quote, unsatisfactory in every way. Instead of paying off the debt, he led the church to take on more debt, which MacLaren implies was in some sense self-serving. What is worse, he led the church to have a very poor reputation in the community. And thus, when MacLaren took the pulpit as pastor of Portland, it was a 6-year-old church that, despite being very exposed and out of the way, was built with room to accommodate 800 parishioners, only having 20 attendees, a bad reputation, and a looming debt. MacLaren began on the 28th of June 1846, starting something very new for the Portland Chapel, morning and evening services. He preached from 3 John verse 8 in the morning and Acts 20:26 in the evening, followed by a prayer meeting on Monday and an additional service on Thursday, as well as a Thursday lecture following the service. This was his regular routine, and it might sound like forcing his people to drink from a fire hose, but one should keep in mind that at this time he was not a prolific preacher or teacher of his own. He was still only a 20-year-old baby-faced recent college grad. The constant preaching and teaching was as much for his own practice as anyone else's benefit. In fact, those who were around for his early ministry reported that his sermons rarely lasted more than 15 minutes, and they often ended with him saying, "I have no more to say." This ending likely came as a relief for the listeners, as MacLaren sometimes spent such long times pausing in an attempt to find the right word that at one point an elderly Scottish woman in the congregation privately asked him if it would be okay if she began sitting closer to him while he was preaching so that she could whisper him the word he was searching for. The content, likewise, was not amazing. He admitted later in life that his sermons in those early days were a combination of the 10 Commandments, the Beatitudes, and Thomas Carlyle. Painful though this process must have been for everyone, he went on preaching and teaching to his 20 or 30 people for almost a full year. And meanwhile, he worked hard to build camaraderie in the congregation, as well as to build rapport in his community. He devoted Tuesdays and Fridays to doing home visitations with his people, and intentionally spent time with ministers and members of other congregations so as to abate the disdain that was felt for his church. He wasn't always sure that things were going to work out. At one point, he wrote home in a very private letter to his family saying, "If the worst comes to the worst, I shall at all events not have to reflect that I killed a flourishing plant. I simply assisted in the funeral of a withering one. The difficulties, however, will keep me busy and at least prevent me from relapsing into idleness." But things did turn up. Toward the end of his first year, he wrote, "We have made as much progress as I ever anticipated during my first year. I have a people united and I think attached to me, and so we will thank God and take courage. Since my coming, the former church has been all but dissolved, a new one being formed which hardly contains any of the former one, and the congregation almost completely altered, yet there is still a little feeling against us and suspicion of us." As the years passed, MacLaren became much better at preaching, the debt was paid down, the church's reputation in the community became very positive, and perhaps most assuringly, the attendance at the church steadily increased, with the exception of the winters, where poor weather caused attendance to fall rather low because of how far out in the country the church was. Attendance records for this era are not readily accessible, but it is known that by his final year, his midweek services were averaging 200 attendees, which was absolutely unheard of in such a small town. Quite frankly, it's unheard of today. Because of the success he was having, a good friend of his named Frederick Lee Brittle asked him to sit for his first portrait ever. MacLaren also fell in love with the local area during this time. The rural environment was a relief to him in comparison to Glasgow and Edinburgh, where he'd grown and attended school. He frequently spent Mondays in what they called the New Forest. He wrote of that time, "I would lay all morning at the foot of some far-spreading elm tree in profound enjoyment, giving half an hour or more, and feeling that it was a well-spent half an hour, to extricating flies from a spider's web, or sometimes reversing the process and assisting the spider to secure its prey. And all the time the birds were singing, slight breezes stirring the leaves. Life was bliss." One who frequently accompanied him to the Isle of Wight said, "I would see during our walks one or two lovely mornings, with wonderful light in his eyes. His lips would slightly part and his face would become almost transfigured, a look of ecstasy as he gazed lovingly, no other word will do, at the minute flowers covering the merest cranny in the moss-grown walls by the roadside. He said no word, but one could see that he was worshipping at the temple's inner shrine." Now, all of that said, it wasn't all perfect all the time. MacLaren had a deep desire to teach, and he thought he'd found a perfect outlet for these longings when the Southampton Athenaeum approached him about lecturing. He quickly put together some lectures on the church and state, which is a truly Baptist issue to want to address, as well as a course on Greek. And because of the good name that he developed in the area, 40 students signed up for his classes immediately. But after only a couple of weeks, only 4 students remained enrolled in his courses. At the end of one of the last lessons, he extinguished his gas lantern and remarked, "Thus is extinguished my attempt to illumine the young men of Southampton." Although continued requests were made of him to teach at the Athenaeum, he took this as a sign that he was called strictly to the pulpit, seeing teaching as only an interference with his preaching from this point forward. As the church continued to grow, he became more and more well-known in the area and began inviting his old friends and colleagues to come fill the pulpit at his now thriving church. The first to come was Thomas Benny himself, his old preaching professor from Stepney. Dr. Benny was indeed impressed and proud of what MacLaren had accomplished at Southampton, especially his constant weekly work ethic, but upon leaving, he commented to a colleague of his own, "The young MacLaren cannot be allowed very much longer to bury himself at Southampton." Soon thereafter, MacLaren also invited another friend, Edward Myle, who was the leader of the Nonconformist at the time. He was more forward and openly compelling MacLaren to become open to opportunities to serving elsewhere, and that soon. Myle attempted to assist MacLaren in getting such opportunities by inviting him to speak at his own church, and this led to other offers to come and do visiting sermons at churches, such as that of Reverend David Thomas at Bristol. Once MacLaren was given platforms and endorsements on prominent stages, offers began coming in that were actually appealing. He had always received offers from other churches, but none of them were any more appealing than what he already had at Southampton. That was until in April of 1858, in his 12th year at Southampton, he received a call to come and fill the vacant pulpit of a large church called Union Chapel in Manchester. Previously, he had found most of the invitations extended to him by open churches to be of very little value, given his lack of a desire to leave Southampton. So he made a regular practice of turning down these offers, and if he happened to commit to one in a moment of pity, he later worked hard to find ways out of such agreements. But in April of 1858, he was newly married. We'll discuss his marriage and family life in depth later. His wife Marian heard that he had agreed to go and fill the vacant pulpit at Union Chapel in Manchester and caught him working to try to get out of it, so she compelled him to keep his word and accept the opportunity. He went and preached on Hebrews 11:1 in the morning and Isaiah 53:6 in the evening, and following the service, the deacons asked him to return the following week. He swiftly declined, having not really wanted to even come that day, let alone return. So he told them, with his typical tact, that he couldn't in good conscience see to their church being cared for while his own suffered neglect. He returned home that evening, but by the following evening, members of the church had arrived at his home to extend a call to him to come and be their pastor. MacLaren makes very clear in his own writings that he had absolutely no desire to take the position. He and his wife were both thrilled to live in the rural Southampton environment, and the church was throbbing with life under his leadership. After 12 years of pastoring the church, he had finally reached the point he wanted to be in. And yet, all around him, voices called for him to go to Manchester. His old college professors encouraged him to take on the job, one even saying, "Now that you are married, you must see how small the pond is at Southampton." Of course, the lucrative difference was notable. The prospect of teaching also entered the scene, and so it was that MacLaren made the decision against all of his own desires to accept the job at Manchester. He writes of the week in which he announced his resignation from Southampton, "I did not announce my decision on Sunday, but called a meeting of the church and congregation for Monday evening. We met in the schoolroom, but had to adjourn to the chapel, and then I tried to make a little speech, but I'm sorry to say I broke down. By dint of swallowing hard, I managed to get through it somehow. And then one of my deacons, a young man named Pegler, tried to move a resolution, but he was obliged to stop. It was the saddest scene I ever witnessed. You can fancy it all without my telling you about it, for indeed, I have no heart to speak of it." The church, in typical small church fashion, seems to have shown the fullest extent of Christian love and appreciation for their outgoing pastor. MacLaren even said, "The cruel tenderness of the last week was agony for me." The church collectively signed a letter of appreciation accompanied by a final love offering to assist him in the costs of moving. This letter he had framed and displayed in his home for the rest of his life. One paragraph of it read, "Some of us can remember the time when, yourself young and inexperienced, and we a mere handful of people, the relation of pastor and flock was set up amongst us. We do not forget the discouraging circumstances under which that relation began. We also remember how slowly the clouds cleared away, and how painfully the upward path was climbed, and how, in the face of many temptations to despair, you manfully stood to your post and resolved to hope. And we feel that it would be difficult, if not impossible, duly to estimate the Christian labor carried on so patiently and so perseveringly." Years later, MacLaren would say to a group of young men in training to be pastors, "I thank God that I was stuck down in a quiet, little, obscure place to begin my ministry. For that is what spoils half of you young fellows. You get pitchforked into prominent positions at once, and then fritter yourselves away in all manner of little engagements that you call duties, instead of stopping at home and reading your Bibles and getting nearer to God. I thank God for the early days of struggle and obscurity." This experience of pastoring in a small, obscure environment before being thrust into a large ministry was shared by Joseph Parker, G. Campbell Morgan, and Charles Spurgeon. And one might even reference John the Baptist, or Elijah, or Moses, who had similar experiences. Perhaps even Jesus could come to mind. And thus it was that Alexander MacLaren came out of the wilderness at Southampton and went about crying like a voice in the city now, making straight the way of the Lord at Manchester. Having preached for the last time at Southampton on the 20th of June 1858, he and his wife took 1 week to move before, on the 4th of July 1858, Alexander MacLaren took his place in the pulpit at Union Chapel in Manchester. That was the first time he ever stood as the pastor of that church. He preached from Matthew 23:8 in the morning and 1 Corinthians 1:22 and 3 in the evening. Little did he know that this was the church he would pastor for the rest of his life. Union Chapel was only 16 years old at the time of his arrival, making it actually a year younger than the church at Southampton. But their background was very different from that which he had inherited early on in his time at Southampton. Union had only ever had one pastor to this point, Francis Tucker. And depending on who you read, some say the congregation was moderate, while others say it was a large and flourishing congregation. But in any case, it was a very different situation from Southampton, and the previous pastor was very highly regarded. One biographer even notes that MacLaren found it quite difficult to follow such a man as Reverend Tucker. And indeed, whatever the number of individuals at Union might have been, the congregation was indisputably composed of a wide variety of individuals who would have been quite difficult to unify and lead. There were individuals of all classes and creeds, rich and prosperous merchants and men distinguished in their professional lives, as well as others working their ways toward success, young men working in offices and warehouses of the city, sitting right next to artisans. Now you'll note that passing phrase, all classes and creeds. That refers to the fact that at Manchester, the Constitution required that the pastor be Baptist, and that he practice only credo baptism by immersion. But membership was open to Christians of all convictions without distinction. And in fact, the deacons of the church that MacLaren inherited were of Presbyterian, Methodist, and Congregationalist convictions, with a number of them also being Baptist. While MacLaren initially attempted to keep up the routine that he'd established at Southampton, preaching twice on Sundays, doing visitation on Tuesdays and Fridays, and having additional midweek services on Thursdays, he soon found that this was far too taxing in a church this size. Instead, he chose to focus his efforts strictly and solely on the pulpit ministry. He dove into sermon preparation to a degree that few can imagine and none would recommend, being known to spend an average of 60 hours per week preparing his sermon for Sunday. He always kept a pair of work boots in his office when he studied, and upon arrival he would take off his regular shoes and put on his work boots so as to remind himself that he was there to do hard labor in preparing this sermon for Sunday. I find this somewhat silly practice to be reminiscent of when he would wear the soldier's gear to study for school as a boy. And one might think that his sermons would be wildly academic or full of materials from the latest intellectuals or politicians, scientists, historians, poets, but they weren't. He resolved to give simple Bible preaching to his people, publicly saying that he abjured forever all the rubbish of intellectual preaching and would rather serve out slops for people to live upon than lumps of stone cut out in the form of loaves. His church, which was then located on Oxford Road, just opposite of Ducey Street, began to grow most notably in intelligentsia, especially the students of nearby Rawdon College. Now, that isn't to say that the members of other areas of life were few in his church, but it is to say that the number of college-educated individuals, especially those interested in missionary work, attending his church was quite high. In fact, in his first year at Manchester, one member took notes of his sermons in shorthand, since he didn't use manuscripts or notes when preaching, and they began to print his sermons in a volume entitled Sermons Preached in Union Chapel, Manchester by Alexander MacLaren. And notably, Alexander did not receive this very graciously, but he did agree to allow them to be published privately for distribution to the church alone. It was only 11 years later that these were distributed to the public. But this length between the private and public distribution shows how obviously displeased that Alexander was with the practice. A decade into his time at Union, the church was bursting at the seams. It was already recognized that Union was the leading church in the city of Manchester. In an attempt to stop the overflow, MacLaren led the church in 1862 to plant a new church, which they successfully did. This, however, did nothing to stop the problem that they had in their own inability to contain the enormous crowds. So in 1868, MacLaren was convinced, despite his trepidation, to lead the Union Church through the process of constructing a new and larger building. MacLaren, because of his typical humility, feared the construction of a new building because, in his words, that he used in private correspondences, he was worried that once it was completed it would forever be half empty. Well, that concern was quickly forgotten. On the 16th of November, 1869, at the age of 33, Alexander MacLaren walked into the new building, which accommodated 1,400 parishioners comfortably and 2,000 at maximum capacity. At a cost of £22,000 sterling, it quickly became known as the Baptist Cathedral of Lancashire. Not only that, but 5 years later in 1874, they were forced to build another massive building at West Gorton because a sister church was closing and they anticipated absorbing their congregation completely. At this time, the Sunday school at Union became larger than any other single church in Manchester, and they would go on to plant 4 more churches and start a school during his tenure. What was perhaps the most wonderful thing about the move from MacLaren's perspective is that it was across the street from Whitworth Park and was removed from the city where his previous church had been. The original building on Oxford Street was loaned out to the United Free Methodist and later purchased thereby. MacLaren had never really adjusted to living in this city again. He wrote at one point, "If you get up on the kitchen table, you can see 20 miles around in every direction, only the smoke prevents it." And this dissatisfaction with the atmosphere at Manchester, which was almost certainly caused by beloved memories of the nature in Southampton that he'd so thoroughly enjoyed, never really left him. Even when he was elderly and preparing for retirement, he wrote, "I suppose what time remains will be spent in this dear, ugly old Manchester where I've labored so long." His general disdain with the climate and city environment of Manchester, coupled with his intense emphasis on sermon preparation as opposed to in-home visitation, which he entirely stopped doing, by the way, by the time he reached his 3rd year at Union, caused many people to describe MacLaren as proud, aloof, remote, or reserved. Some who were more sympathetic to him called him shy, but in reality, it's fair to say that MacLaren was simply unconfident. Those who knew him closely report that after every single sermon he preached, he fell into a recognizable period of suffering where he was positive that he had failed. He regularly walked off stage, having just brought the entire audience to tears or ecstasy, only to say to the first person he saw, "I can't help it. I did my best and I just have to leave it." A friend once asked him, "Are you not encouraged by the crowds constantly applauding your sermons?" To which he responded, "No, it makes no difference. It's a very small thing that I should be judged by all of you, or by any man's judgment. He that judgeth me is the Lord." As you may be picking up, MacLaren's anxiety over preaching and his feelings of inadequacy really can't be overstated. It seems to have gotten much worse after an event involving Dr. Benny, who, remember, was his idol and advisor in college. Having compelled him to leave Southampton, Dr. Benny came on one occasion to hear Alexander preach years later in his ministry at Manchester. The year was 1870, and MacLaren was preaching one of his most famous sermons that he ever preached in his life. It was called The Secret of Power. He delivered it to the London Missionary Society at Surrey Chapel. Dr. Benny attended the meeting and heard the sermon that was later published as one of the greatest sermons of the 19th century, and at the conclusion of the service, MacLaren approached Benny. Benny was taller than MacLaren, and so he literally looked up to him and is said to have waited in anticipation for several seconds for words of confirmation or critique. Benny paused for some time, and after standing for a moment without any words being spoken, finally spoke. But when the words did come, they weren't even about the sermon. MacLaren must have known that this was one of his best sermons ever, but the seeming lack of any positive reflection by his most admired mentor absolutely crushed him. What he didn't know, and regrettably what he never learned in his entire life, was that Dr. Benny wrote in a letter afterwards, "I went straight home and wept. Never before did I understand the Old Testament text, 'The Lord said by the hand of Moses,' as he had explained it. Not only had I failed to live up to the ideal that MacLaren set before us that night, I had not even tried to live up to it." So instead of being disappointed by the sermon, Dr. Benny was deeply convicted by the sermon, beyond words. He was literally in shock, mourning over his own sin. But MacLaren never learned that. And instead, he took his silence as hesitation to even comment on the sermon. Now, what seemed to MacLaren to be a crushing review from someone he so respected only compounded his issues before a crowd. One author close to him said that he always suffered from stage fright. He frequently used biblical language to speak of the engagements that he had throughout the week, speaking of Sunday services as woes to be endured. Only on Mondays was he seemingly happy, as he said he had endured the final woe, yesterday's sermon, and the next one was far enough away as to not require any thought yet. Here we see that the man preaching to an average crowd of 1,500 individuals 3 or 5 times a week was absolutely unsure of himself, despite all of their elation with him. One author rightly points out that because MacLaren didn't do home visitations in his own church, he should have been shocked by the magnetic draw that he received at Manchester, because that meant that despite his not going to the people, thousands of people were coming to him. Such was his attractive power over one of the greatest and most influential congregations in Manchester. In 1872, the church opened the People's Institute in Rusholme, and in 1880 they opened a school at which MacLaren began lecturing on literary and ecclesiastical topics, as well as biblical issues, such as German higher criticism and scriptural eisegesis. And after many years of being chosen more frequently than anyone else to preach the associational annual meeting and write the circular letter to be sent to all the churches in the Lancashire and Cheshire Association of Baptist Churches, he was voted in 1875 to become the president of the Baptist Union of Great Britain. At the age of 49, he was the youngest person ever to be voted to this office, which most usually belonged to septua and octogenarians. Odd though it may seem to speak of MacLaren's late life as beginning in his 50s, given that he lived well into his 80s, it's appropriate to see this as the time in which he crossed over into his aged years, because it was during this decade that his life took a serious turn. For one, his health began to fail severely and irredeemably. He also began losing family members, his wife in 1884, his siblings, and many old friends. Now, that's not to say that his later years were filled with sorrow and regret by any means. This era could be said to have begun in 1877 when he received a Doctor of Divinity from the University of Edinburgh. He was the first nonconformist to receive such an honor from the university, and although he was initially inclined to decline the offer, he was filled with thoughts of his father and his grandparents, who were such proud Scots, and he thought it his duty to accept such an honor, being a Scotsman and the university being among the best Scottish institutions around. But soon after, in 1880, he fell very sick and began to be unable to preach at all. He was soon diagnosed with neuralgia, a rare condition wherein pain follows the path of a nerve, usually in the face, causing a sharp, shooting, stabbing, or burning pain. Depending on the location, it's likened to the sensation experienced by people with shingles or neuropathy, or when experienced in the face, it's likened to undergoing electric shock. Now, one can scarcely imagine what could possibly have been done for such an ailment in 1880, but we shouldn't be surprised that his church gave him indefinite leave and a promise of his position upon his return. He considered resigning, but his wife convinced him to simply take a long trip with her instead to try to get in better environs and see if a new climate could help. They spent the next 4 months in Avamore before coming back, and upon his return, MacLaren requested the church hire him an assistant pastor, which was done immediately. As an aside, one should note here that from 1858 to 1881, MacLaren solo pastored a church with an average attendance of 1,500 people without having any previous experience doing anything like that. He also restricted himself to preaching once per Sunday following that, rather than both morning and evening services. But this situation didn't seem to dramatically help. He wrote to a friend in 1882 lamenting that he was stuck in grimy old Lancashire, saying, "It cannot go on. The worry of it and the poor results of all the worry will force me to cut it soon. If I cannot find a colleague or a curate, I see nothing for it but to resign, and indeed, if I could see any congenial work in London, I think I should do so now, for apart from all the other considerations, I feel as if I couldn't stand this climate much longer, and should like to be in the sunshine at the end. Although I'm at my wit's end, I cannot see my way. The feelings of unsettlement is miserable and hindering. But I suppose I must just wait till the cloud moves. I can for the most part, but sometimes I get impatient." Parishioners in this era began to notice that he was grasping the sides of the pulpit, either to study himself or hide the pain that he was in. Devastatingly, on the 21st of December 1884, just before Christmas, his wife Marion unexpectedly died after being sick for roughly a week with what was originally thought to have been a simple cold. What is worse, the doctor said that she died of pleurisy, inflammation of the lungs somewhat similar to the flu or pneumonia, which was almost certainly contracted while walking to and from evening church the week prior in the cold, wet air of Manchester. At this point, one would be sane to think that he surely resigned from the church, but he did not feel the assistant pastor currently in place was sufficiently able to take his place if he did so. So on he trudged for 3 more years before the Baptist Union of Great Britain offered him the opportunity to go on a trip to Australia to represent them during the series of celebrations recognizing the Jubilee year of Queen Victoria and celebrating the centenary year of the Australian colonies. They had a plan to fundraise £50,000 sterling for the Baptist Union churches in Australia, and they felt Dr. MacLaren was a magnanimous figure capable of raising the funds. They also secretly hoped that the warm climate would do his health some good. So, on the 21st of September 1888, MacLaren and his 2 unmarried daughters set sail from London on board the Britannia, en route for none other than Adelaide, where they arrived after almost a month exactly of perfectly calm and enjoyable seas with occasional stops in historic and exotic places. Upon docking on the 29th of October, the first visitor on the ship was an elderly man who brought with him a crumpled old marriage certificate. On the license was the signature of the man, along with his wife, and the minister who had overseen their wedding in Adelaide in 1826, David MacLaren, Alexander's father. Upon disembarking, he found that an unexpectedly large number of people were still alive and present who had known his father and sat under his preaching during his 4 years at Adelaide. And this beginning typifies the experience that MacLaren had during his trip, which was one of the greatest of his life. He found himself in much better health almost immediately, enjoying the warmth and the sunlight as well as the views of greenery and calm seas. He began preaching twice per Sunday and once in the middle of the week again, and here to greater crowds than ever before. He was noted as having preached to over 3,000 individuals on Sunday, the 18th of November of 1888, at the North Adelaide Baptist Church, and hundreds more had been sent away for a lack of room. That evening, hundreds came to hear him at Flinders Street Baptist Church, and he began taking tours all over the country, even into the Sounds of New Zealand. There, he found himself so blissfully amazed that he wrote, "Sorrowfully I must confess, it beats Scotland hollow, and is the loveliest spot ever dreamt of." In the spring of 1889, his family boarded the Carthage and made their voyage back to Scotland. He had procured just short of £100,000 sterling for the Australian Baptist, nearly double what he was asked to secure. Upon his return to Manchester, he discovered that his assistant pastor had resigned and taken a call elsewhere. In a pinch, he chose to take up the full duties until someone could be found to serve as an assistant. Given his reinvigorated state after returning from Australia, one can imagine why he felt that he might be able to do this, but the pollution and climate of the industrialized city of Manchester soon took its toll, and he ran out of steam quite quickly. His advisory council encouraged him to reach out to his old friend, R.H. Roberts, the pastor of the Baptist Church at Notting Hill, who would later become the president at Regent's Park College. They had heard that Roberts' son, J. Edward Roberts, was a fine preacher of notable youth and capabilities. Perhaps he would be able to take up the burden alongside MacLaren. However, MacLaren was very nervous. He knew the capacity of a college student, as he had experienced ministry freshly out of college in his own experience at Southampton, and he didn't prefer bringing young men directly out of college into a massive church with enormous responsibilities and public renown. So he spoke against bringing Roberts, saying that he's just a mere boy. But the council was persistent, and so MacLaren finally consented. On the 12th of January, 1890, J. Edward Roberts came to preach at Union Chapel. He had never met nor seen Dr. MacLaren in person, so he was unaware if he was even in attendance. Upon preaching that evening, Roberts said that an elderly man approached him in the vestry upon preparing to leave. Linking their arms, the man said that he had heard him preach and wanted to know if he'd be available to come again if called upon. He told the old man yes, and the man went on to encourage him, noting that his nervousness before such a large crowd was perfectly understandable in a raw student. It wasn't until the following week that Roberts says that he discovered the man was Dr. MacLaren himself. And for the rest of his life, J. Edward Roberts wrote that he would never forget the simplicity and sympathy of that great preacher and that first contact with a raw, nervous student. Dr. MacLaren began speaking frequently and openly about retiring from the ministry following J. Edward Roberts coming on as a fellow pastor. In 1885, he had received an offer to become a professor of Hebrew at Regent's Park College, which he had thought would make Marion happy, but ultimately he declined it. He would have been expected to preach weekly at Bloomsbury Chapel, which sounded like a job enough on its own, and he still had a bad taste in his mouth from his brief stint lecturing at the Athenaeum of Southampton. Upon returning from Australia, he'd spoken publicly about taking a trip to America, and perhaps even moving there permanently. He reached out to a friend named William Wilkinson, a professor in the United States, to talk about it. Wilkinson later wrote, "Unknowing of his fame in this country, he asked me whether I thought that some pulpit might be open to him among us if he did come." Wilkinson reached out to the president of the University of Chicago asking if MacLaren could be offered a position. The president immediately offered him either a position teaching homiletics or a position as the university preacher. But when MacLaren ultimately turned down these positions, he wrote to a friend saying, "I am resolved that I shall never see America, and this is one of the great mistakes of my life." It seems that MacLaren simply didn't know where to go or what to do, so he stayed where he was. And so for another 6 years he went along at Manchester, training and apprenticing J. Edward Roberts to come along as his successor. On the 15th of January, 1897, the entire city of Manchester celebrated MacLaren's Jubilee, as he had simultaneously turned 70 years old and celebrated 50 years in the public ministry. Over 400 Baptist pastors alone attended a ceremony in his honor, in addition to a great deal of other religious and civic leaders. The citizens of the city of Manchester voted to pay for a statue to be carved of MacLaren at the city's expense to be displayed prominently in town. MacLaren, horrified at the thought of a large statue of himself featured in the city, proposed to have a portrait hanged in the city art gallery instead, and he requested that the artist commissioned to do so be a Scotsman, as he was convinced that, quote, "only a Scotsman can truly depict a Scotsman." Sir George Reed, the president of the Royal Scottish Academy, was obliged to take the job. At the celebration, he was praised and lauded for an entire day before finally rising at the end of the ceremonies to give a speech. One part of his speech included these words, "Your praise wakes my conscience. And the things look so different seen from the inside from what they do from the outside. There rise up so many specters of mingled motives, perfunctory work, and opportunities let slip, that it's hard to believe that anybody could look at my work, which I know to be so poor, and find such words as my friends have used today to characterize it. I'm embarrassed, but more than grateful, and my thanks are due and are tendered from my heart to so many of my friends that I scarcely know where to begin. A man must be worth very little if other people's praise does not set him upon very strict self-examination, and the first effect of all these kindly things that have been said about me this afternoon is to make me feel how little I deserve to be thought of in this way, or spoken of by you. Still, these are thoughts for one's own heart, one's own chamber, not meant to be spoken here." MacLaren had every intention to retire at that point, even writing to a close friend, "I've been fairly well since my Eastern trip," that is, the trip to Australia, "but I'm very weary now and do not know exactly whether to resign in June when I've done my full 50 years, or whether to hold on a little longer." His friend, along with several others, encouraged him to keep pastoring. So Dr. MacLaren pressed on with this near-reckless sense of self-sacrifice for 7 additional years before retiring. In the interim, he was re-elected president of the Baptist Union and was made governor of the Owens College at Victoria University, as well as the director of the Ryland Library and a key figure in the oversight of their theological faculty. In 1901, while president of the Baptist Union, he was called on to directly address the sovereign, as he delivered a deputation from the Union to the hand of King Edward VII in the first year of his reign. He said he felt honored that His Majesty gave him his undivided attention. The next year, he received a Doctor of Letters degree from Victoria University, and he received the degree directly from the hand of the Prince of Wales himself, the future King George V. In 1905, MacLaren was elected as the first president of the Baptist World Alliance and was recognized as a key figure in its organization alongside John Clifford, J.H. Shakespeare, A.T. Robertson, and J.N. Prestridge. In his address, he set a precedent by quoting from the hymn, "Blessed be the tie that binds." The hymn was sung thereafter at the opening of every BWA conference. Now, from the beginning of this episode, the comparison has been made between MacLaren and Spurgeon on several occasions. And that's because Alexander MacLaren was born 8 years prior to Spurgeon, and he died 18 years after Spurgeon did, meaning that he spanned the entirety of Spurgeon's life and more. They both lived in Great Britain, they were both Baptist preachers, and they were both major figures in the Baptist Union during what was historically called the downgrade controversy. In fact, when Spurgeon was at the height of the controversy, a 4-man delegation representing the Baptist Union was appointed to go to the Metropolitan Tabernacle on the 13th of January, 1888, in an attempt to reconcile with Spurgeon. The 4 members of the delegation were Samuel Harris Booth, James Culross, John Clifford, and Alexander MacLaren. Unfortunately, because of illness, MacLaren did not attend. It's been speculated that MacLaren was the most likely to side with Spurgeon. Whatever the case, 5 days later, the Baptist Union voted to accept Spurgeon's withdrawal, and the downgrade was complete. 3 years later, Spurgeon was in such poor health that he would be dead within a year, while MacLaren was re-elected president of the Baptist Union. So, given these events, can we take it that MacLaren was no real friend to Spurgeon? It should be noted that early in MacLaren's ministry, Charles Spurgeon labeled him publicly as a dangerous man, and stated that he would never let MacLaren speak at the tabernacle. Why Spurgeon said these things is the subject of much speculation. Some take it as simply being the result of MacLaren's eccentricities in the early days. For one, he never wore clerical clothing. Even when he went to Manchester, he had to be requested to carry on their tradition that the pastor should wear a white tie, as was the norm for pastors in the era. But this hardly constitutes dangerous. Others have speculated that MacLaren bordered on the edge of heterodox, with some claiming that he denied the inerrancy of Scripture, while others claim he denied eternal punishment in hell, and still yet others claim that he believed and taught that there could be actual communion between the living and the dead. It must be stated outright that none of these things are reflected in any of the sermons that he published, which compose thousands and thousands of pages. And indeed, other experts on his words write that he believed exactly the opposite, saying, quote, MacLaren shared the fundamental conviction and the full inspiration of every part of Holy Writ and had no doubts about the Bible's divine authority. The most likely reason, in my opinion, that Spurgeon identified MacLaren as being dangerous was because he was unwilling, that is, MacLaren was unwilling to declare a side in the conflict, and he was therefore just as dangerous as someone who was against Spurgeon. Specifically on the topic of higher criticism, MacLaren's Greek expertise prompted great interest in the recent discoveries of Westcott and other Greek papyri. He was once approached by a schoolmaster asking about critical questions on the Old Testament. The man ultimately said, I must confess, when I went to Dr. MacLaren, I got very little help. He was a master of all of the positions of the critics, but the whole bent of his mind was conservative. The Bible had been criticized enough, he said. It needs appreciation, not criticism. He seemed to believe that the work he had to do was to lay in a region beyond what the critics knew. He was intensely insistent that the pulpit was the place for the proclamation of certainties, not for arguments, discussions, or apologies. And this is an entirely believable testimony of Dr. MacLaren, as he definitely avoided disputable positions in his preaching and teaching. For example, when you read his Expositions on Revelation, you will not find a single sermon on Revelation 19 or 20, making it virtually impossible to deduce his view on the controversial topic of the millennium. Those close to him, such as W.B. Glover, wrote that he was tolerant of higher criticism and even entertained the possibility that the story of the fall was mythical. Elsewhere, Ian Sellers writes, in the pulpit, He expounded evangelical certainties, yet his writings and private conversations showed him prepared to accept a critical position. His attitudes are therefore ambiguous. In one place, he's said to have been ready to accept whatever the critics could clearly demonstrate, while also being very slow to admit that the radical ideas had been demonstrated. So while one could make a valid argument that MacLaren accepted the possibility of higher critical arguments discrediting the historical or scientific viability of the Bible, he never seems to have positively affirmed that they had actually done so. Further, Spurgeon himself excludes MacLaren from his list of downgraders when he listed them. On the other end, MacLaren is noted as having always spoken with the utmost cordiality of high appreciation concerning Mr. Spurgeon, even in private conversations confirming his belief that Mr. Spurgeon possessed, quote, all the native force and aptitude of mind needed to have made him distinctly a scholar and thinker, instead of the great popular voice that he had chosen chiefly to be. In MacLaren's latest years, just 2 years prior to his own death, he wrote in 1908, I have been reading a number of Spurgeon's sermons and have been wonderfully helped and stirred by them. There's a passion of love to Jesus and a great fullness of trust in him which has stirred and rebuked me. So were MacLaren and Spurgeon enemies? Doubtful. They were both wildly successful, with Spurgeon being the only pastor to circulate more of his sermons than MacLaren. They both shared many of the same convictions theologically. The main difference seems to be that MacLaren believed that belief in and usage of higher criticism was not an issue of such importance as to break fellowship with others, while Spurgeon considered it of such importance as to do so. MacLaren seems to have held that so long as the gospel was conveyed, criticism and other secondary issues were quite really of no effect whatsoever. Spurgeon seems to have held that tertiary and secondary sacrifices on historical doctrines would inevitably lead to sacrifices on historical doctrines of primary importance. And by the way, if you look into the church of Dr. MacLaren, Union Chapel today, I think you'll find Spurgeon was a bit more of a prophet than MacLaren would have wanted to recognize. Alexander MacLaren was and is known as the Prince of Expositors. In fact, in 1964, John Pitts published an article in Christianity Today in which he identified MacLaren as, quote, the supreme example, the perfect type of the classic Protestant tradition of expository preaching. When John Brown delivered his Yale lectures on Puritan preaching in England, he presented a full analysis of Alexander MacLaren's preaching. With this much magnanimity surrounding his expositions, it should be noted from the start that he is specifically called the Prince of Expositors, while Charles Spurgeon is called the Prince of Preachers, because MacLaren, while considered a much better expositor of the text, Jimmy Reagan bluntly says MacLaren was nowhere near the pastor Spurgeon was. MacLaren simply was not a brilliant speaker or preacher. He was unparalleled in his ability to interpret and deliver the truths of the Bible in a direct, intelligible, and applicable manner, but he was far from dynamic, charismatic, and I mean that in the non-Pentecostal sense, or eye-catching. In fact, from the time MacLaren awoke on Sunday mornings, his intent was to be the very lowest thing on the list of people's thoughts. Through the service, he didn't stand at all until he rose to go into the pulpit. When the congregation rose to read the scriptures or sing songs, he said he felt it was best for him to remain seated because it kept others from thinking that he was anything more than another parishioner in all of these acts. At one point, a congregant approached him and said, Dr. MacLaren, it's as if you wish to be invisible from the time that you leave your study until you're in the pulpit. He responded, You've just about hit it. Elsewhere, he said, To efface oneself is one of the preacher's first duties. The herald should be lost in his message. He wanted nothing to do with personal gain or lauding. You'll recall his embarrassment at the Jubilee celebration and the manner in which he felt compelled to balance their praise with criticisms of his failures. He felt entirely that his job was to be, quote, neither a priest nor a philosopher, but a messenger and a proclaimer. Indeed, for those whom he deemed as seeking to make a name for themselves by proclaiming a message that was uniquely their own, he quoted from Acts, saying, The feet of them that are to carry thee out are already at the door. He considered the only act of eternal worth to be preaching the divine word without anything else mixed in. Indeed, he claimed that mixing in anything else was not preaching at all. And this resulted in his preaching being entirely bereft of any reference to social, economic, or political ongoings of his time. He had little to say regarding in-house issues, such as source criticism. He even said that he preferred not to preach about baptism. He had even less to say about major worldwide issues, such as slavery, even though almost every one of his mentors had been a thoroughgoing and very public abolitionist. In his sermons, he would almost never even tell stories or allude to current events to give examples. Instead, he relied on metaphors and imagery to illustrate points, so as to avoid any appearance that he was speaking on current events rather than simply detailing the meaning of the text at hand. One preacher who was displeased with what he perceived as avoidance of important matters confronted MacLaren about this habit. "Why don't you ever address the issues of our times?" the man asked. MacLaren responded, "Surely, when all of you are preaching up the times, you may allow one poor brother to preach up Christ and eternity." We've spoken already about his avoidance of debatable issues in favor of what he saw as a proclaiming of the simple gospel. And for better or worse, this was him. When approaching a text, he never sought to divide the text in a way that could be perceived as artificial. He never forced alliterations into his outline. He never named a sermon anything sensational or even memorable for that matter. He simply took the text as it was and sought to convey the truths in such a way that at the end of the sermon a listener would be left wondering how they didn't see the text meaning before all on their own. Ferris D. Witzel identifies his sermon preparation method as the disciplined approach, because he would begin at 9 a.m. every day and shut himself in his study, devoting many exacting hours to preparing the sermon. As already stated, usually it was about 60 hours a week. He believed it was his job to open the text such that those least endowed with specially brilliant gifts would have the meaning of the text in their minds upon leaving. His method was this. First, he would approach the text as a learner, attempting to learn what the passage teaches, addresses, and considers. He discouraged using text to teach doctrines already borne in mind when approaching the text. Secondly, having discovered the primary meaning of the text as it stands, he investigated the Hebrew or Greek of the passage to see if the English text he had at hand conveyed the true meaning of all the words in their original. He explicitly forbade taking what he called homiletical license with the scriptures, such that words could be reinterpreted to fit a topic a given preacher wished to address when they did not mean that directly in the original. Third, he would attempt to cast the teachings of the text into the best possible fresh mold of expression, answering to his own conception of what the teaching is. For example, in his sermons on passages addressing slavery, he spoke of slavery to Christ, rather than using the opportunity to address the issue of slavery itself, as he found that the central teaching of Scripture was always Christ and the gospel of salvation. Fourth, he would divide the text into headings based purely on how the text seemed to be divided intrinsically. And fifth, having done all of this, he would pray and meditate on the sermon itself, having at this point written nothing down. He considered this to be the most important part of the process. He called it the long, patient, brooding thought centered on the text. And this brings back to our attention the fact that while MacLaren would often write down the first 2 sentences of his sermon's introduction, he never manuscripted anything. All of his sermons, as recorded in the 17-volume Exposition of the Scriptures set, are produced by way of a stenographer who wrote down what he said from the pulpit. There were no notes to collect at the end of the sermon. In fact, on a given Sunday morning, he would spend the morning hours reading and praying and then lead his family in worship. They would read the 95th or 96th Psalm, and then he would vanish for the rest of the morning after a rapidly eaten breakfast. When he and his family rode together in a carriage to church, he never spoke at all. At that point, they considered him to be entirely consumed in the sermon. His delivery of the sermon, as mentioned, left much to be desired. Those who heard him said that while he was a greatly genuine man, there was a noted absence of tenderness and pathos in his preaching. His sermons, while understood to be tenderly thought out, were described as somehow failing to be tenderly felt in the speaking. One person described him by saying, "While he sincerely mourns over Jerusalem, he does not uncontrollably weep over Jerusalem." Another parishioner once wrote of him, "One wishes at times that this clear-headed, true-hearted, nay, gentle-hearted man could remember the words of Virgil in the Aeneid, Sunt lachrym rerum. There are tears for things." There should now and again be tears in the ink with which the preacher writes, and tears in the tones with which the preacher speaks. Perhaps it's best that his sermons were never very long. Usually they were about 4,000 words, taking roughly 30 to 40 minutes to deliver. Hughes Oliphant Old noted that his brevity was one of his greatest virtues. By the end of his life, there were many who noted being disappointed when his sermons had ended. And all of this might leave a person believing that he was essentially a commentary author who happened to stumble accidentally behind a pulpit one day. And that honestly is not a terrible caricature of him, to be fair, but he understood that there was a need for all types of preachers. In fact, when he was in Australia, he noted that the churches in England sending preachers to that island could not afford to send out men to preach threadbare platitudes. But instead, he said, they needed to send men who could hold their own with a highly intelligent and well-educated people. So when reflecting on MacLaren the Expositor, we're left with a very direct and straightforward picture. He addressed few to no current events or philosophical debates. He was not a theologian, but a proclaimer of the gospel, and that by design rather than by inability to do other. He deliberately avoided controversial topics of non-gospel connected nature, regardless of degree of importance, such as baptism, source criticism, or even slavery. In reality, we can judge him for better or worse on the basis of this choice in his ministry, but I choose to let him defend himself. He said, "I have become convinced that I was best serving all the varied social, economic, and political interests that are dear to me by preaching what I conceive to be the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I have limited myself to that work accordingly. I am sure, with a growing conviction day by day, that so we Christian ministers best serve our generation. My work, whatever yours may be, is and has been for 38 years, and I hope will be a little while longer yet, to preach Jesus Christ as the King of England and the Lord of all our communities and the Savior and friend of the individual soul. I began my ministry with the determination of concentrating all my available strength on the proper work of the Christian ministry, the pulpit. I have tried to make my ministry a ministry of exposition of Scripture. I have done my best, and there I leave it." Now, contrary to some of the other figures that we've covered in the directory, Alexander MacLaren was a family man. He first saw the woman that was to become his wife when he was 10 years old. She was 8 years old, and she and Alexander spent a whole day pestering her nurse to let them play mom and dad to her little sister, who was a newborn at the time. That was the year 1836. He and Marion would begin courting almost 20 years later in the autumn of 1855. And up to this point, I've only referred to his wife Marion as Marion, because her maiden name is quite revealing. She was born Marion MacLaren. You heard that right. She was born a MacLaren, and indeed, she was Alexander's cousin. They were aware of the fact that they were cousins. He did not hide this. Now, mind you, this is the early to mid-1800s in Scotland, so ideas surrounding appropriate marital candidates were a bit different from our modern conception, but that is a fact of history, and it must be admitted. If we are able to get past the unpalatable truth of their relation, there is actually quite a precious love story between the two. Having grown up together for obvious reasons, they fell in love as children and began formally courting in their 20s during the fall of 1855. They got engaged in November of 1855 and married on the 27th of March, 1856. According to Scottish tradition, their wedding was at her father's house. And she, just like Alexander's mother, was the daughter of a deacon at the church. Her father was James MacLaren, a deacon at the church of Dr. Lindsay Alexander. Reverend David Russell, the same man who led Alexander to the Lord years earlier, officiated their wedding. Marion had brown eyes and early on in life very dark brown hair, although this turned platinum white rather early in her adulthood. She had what was described as a steady face which always wore a smile, ever how slight. She was slightly pale, but had dark, sunny eyes, and in school had been a top athlete who also performed at the head of her class academically. As regards her personality, she was said to be frank to the point of approaching a total lack of self-consciousness. In fact, as previously mentioned, it was at her prompting that MacLaren went to Manchester to preach for the first time at Union Chapel when he would have otherwise backed out of the commitment. She was confident enough to tell him that to do so would be a breach of a commitment that he had made, and she made no qualms about pointing out to him that such would be breaking his word, an unforgivable thing of a man in his day, especially a minister. And this willingness to speak her mind in such a transparent way to her husband is only a small indication of the fact that she would have been what we call today a type A personality, a natural-born leader. In 1872, while at Manchester, the church started what they called the MacLaren Memorial Mission House, which was to be more of a school than a mission, attempting to raise educational levels in one of the most impoverished areas of their community. Marion took charge of the reading department, personally selecting all of the books to be used in the curriculum of each class. She also led the devotion to the children from the Bible to conclude each school day. And she also personally started the Juvenile Dorcas Society, as well as the Juvenile Temperance Society, showing that she was a go-getter if ever there was one in her day. But none of this should lead you to believe that she was a modern woman, spending her time mostly outside of the home. When Alexander was spending 60 hours per week studying his sermons, she was leading her children in family worship every day, with Alexander himself admitting that the children's religious teaching was primarily their mother's responsibility. While they did employ nurses to assist with housekeeping and at times child-rearing, which was quite normal, in fact, up until the mid-20th century, she regularly made a point to take her 3 daughters and 1 son to a little area called Greenays, just outside the city limits of Manchester, where there were fields they would walk in and ducks that she would let the children bring bread to feed. I previously mentioned Alexander's disciplined Sunday morning habits. While she had the nurses preparing their children for church, she made a point to console her husband as to his anxieties over the sermon and the service. He was sometimes so upset with himself after a sermon that he would become rude with her over how she tried to encourage him. And she understood that this was part of his character to be so hard on himself. But unable to stop herself from trying to encourage him, he ultimately took the opportunity to begin walking home from church while she and the children rode home in the carriage. Well, that lasted for a while until she began sending the children home and walking alongside him. She simply refused to allow him to be so down on himself, and in later life, he appreciated this immensely. Their marriage was very loving and caring. They regularly went to the Halle concerts to listen to classical music. In evenings, when Alexander had nothing planned, the entire family would gather around and spend the whole afternoon listening to him read. He reflected later in life that it was very abnormal that all of the children, as well as Marion and he himself, never tired of this. They all enjoyed being together listening to Alexander read for hours on end. Only a few years into his ministry at Manchester in 1862, Marion fell very sick and was unable to do much of anything. As medical remedies were archaic at this time, the church proposed that she and Alexander take an extended vacation to see if a change in climate could improve their state. The couple accepted this offer, and towards the end of January 1863, they left for Venice, Italy, to spend a few months away. Unexpectedly, not only did Marion's health improve, but Alexander's health markedly improved as well upon arrival, showing the poor conditions that they were both living in at Manchester. Because both of their conditions had so improved, they spent several months in Italy as a healthy young couple on vacation, and they spent the rest of their lives speaking of the 3 months of almost uninterrupted sunshine, especially of the Italian sunsets. Alexander actually wrote a book about this trip that sold many copies. Of course, they did have to return to Manchester and the terrible environment of an industrialized city with smoke and cloud cover constantly. This, coupled with the frequent cold and freezing rains, caused serious problems for the rest of their lives. In June of 1878, their youngest daughter, tragically named Marion after her mother, died at the age of 18 of a sudden illness that was completely unexpected, unexplained, and unavoidable. Sadly, this served as only a harbinger of things to come. Rather early for a woman of her age, Marion began showing signs of rheumatism, broadly similar to arthritis in terms of muscle and joint stiffness. On occasion, she would take trips to Buxton to bathe in hot springs that were known to relieve the pain of that type. As she struggled with these health issues of her own, those who knew her said that she began to lose her typically bright and enthusiastic personality due to anxiety over Alexander's waning health. As he became sicker and sicker each passing year, she tried to find places that he could go to in order to enjoy better climates and cleaner air. In August of 1884, they were set to leave on a vacation she had planned to western Scotland, but Alexander became so sick on the day that they were meant to leave that they postponed the trip a few days, and even when they did leave, they only made it as far as Edinburgh before being forced to stop and try to get him to fuller strength before disembarking again. Marion's family was so worried about Alexander that they came to visit him, indicating that they expected that he may be on his deathbed. However, upon arrival, they expressed more concern over how Marion looked than how he did. Evidently, the stress of worrying about him had taken a physical and obvious toll on her. While at Edinburgh nursing him to health, she wrote a letter to a friend admitting, "I have had great anxiety, and I cannot explain exactly how, but it has a hold on me. I feel it." As fall of 1884 turned into winter, she began mentioning that her rheumatism was becoming worse. She made a trip to Buxton, but upon returning, she reported that it had not made any difference at all, which was abnormal from its usual effects. On the 10th of December, 1884, she made her usual trip to church for Wednesday night services, despite the typically bad weather of Manchester in the dead of winter. After service, she told Alexander that she felt as if she might be coming down with a cold. She spent several days feeling a bit under the weather, but on the 17th of December, she lost all of her remaining strength. Doctors reported that it was pleurisy, an inflammation of the lungs similar to pneumonia. On Sunday morning, the 21st of December, 1884, she passed away. Alexander took only 3 weeks away from the ministry before returning to full-time pulpit service. And while he returned to work, it would be appropriate to say that Alexander fell into a very deep depression following Marion's death that he never really emerged out of. He could scarcely write a letter without talking about her for the rest of his life, which spanned another 26 years. Throughout these years, he most vividly described himself through illustration, saying, "You might have noticed how a watch gives a tick or two even after the mainspring is broken. So also, I go on with my ticking in the same way, but there's little heart in it, and I think that little gets less. I suppose I will stop ticking altogether before long." He wrote sometimes of those 2 years they shared at Southampton prior to coming to Manchester, saying, "They were the best of our life. She was so enamored at the warm weather that she would often stand at the window sill and just place her hand on the sill to feel the warmth. I would sit, unbeknownst to her, watching all the while in great bliss." A decade after her death, he wrote about this, saying, "I can see her right now, and I remember the thankful wonder with which I looked at her." Visions of this sort never seemed to have left him, and it seems that this is the kind of thing that led some skeptics to say that he believed that you could communicate with the dead. He wrote in March of 1888 about walking past the home in which she died. He had moved by that time, and he wrote to a friend saying, "I walked past the house this morning. Every yard of that road has memories for me. The happy Sunday mornings when we walked together home, times when I met her coming back from Dorcas as I was walking down to service, and I would see how wearily she was toiling along, and how her face brightened as she saw me, though she was a long way down the road. One such time is often present to me, a happy, glad look, the quickened step, the rest in our hearts. It all stands before me far clearer than what we call the present, and I can see the evening light in the sky, and can hear the thrushes that were singing. And now I was walking down the road alone in a snowstorm, seeing strange faces looking out the windows of the home at me. It's a bitter cup, and sometimes I cannot say I can drink it. I might bear it if it were emptied in a single draught, but this slow trickling drop by drop every day, all day, it's hard to accept." 5 years after her death, he reported that he would sit and read for hours, but all the while he would simply be staring at a page, seeing nothing but her face. He would spend hours attempting to write, only to wake up having spent hours thinking about her. He dreamt about her, seeing her face, hearing her voice, and would wake up feeling as if he had actually been with her. He began to ask his friends, "Is it wrong of me to wish for the last sleep to come soon?" His trip to Australia with his daughters did him a lot of good, as before the trip he nearly rejected the opportunity, saying that he would, quote, "rather sit still right here with her face hanging beside my chair and nothing to do but feed on the past, for that's my real life, the past. All this hubbub is a sham." Thankfully, his daughters talked him into going on the trip with them. And even while he enjoyed the trip, he still wrote to a friend while away, "Old days have been tugging on my heart, and I don't feel as if I can turn away from the thoughts, so sweet, so bitter. If only she had been here." When the topic of writing a biography on him was broached, he said clearly that his life had been, quote, "smooth, but for one fatal blow, which at times made all the others seem of small worth. God allowed us to be together till the dark December of 1884. Others could speak of her charm, her beauty, her gifts, and her goodness, but most of what she was to me is forever locked in my heart. In any writings of what I am or have been able to do, it should be told that the best part of it all came and comes from her. We read and thought together, and her clear, bright intellect illumined obscurities and rejoiced in truth. We worked and we bore together, and her courage and deftness made toil easy and charmed away difficulties. She lived a life of nobleness, of strenuous effort, of aspiration, of sympathy, self-forgetfulness, and love. She was my guide, my inspirer, my corrector, my reward. Of all human formative influences on my character and life, hers is the strongest and the best. To write of me and not to name her is to present a fragment." Before we close, I'd like to give you a few, and I mean a very, very few, because of the length of this episode already, a few quotes by MacLaren that I think are noteworthy. MacLaren once said, "Sympathy is the parent of wise counsel. Advice without it is generally foolish and always disagreeable." Speaking to the Baptist World Alliance in 1905, he said, "Power for service is second. Power for holiness and character is first. The first, second, and third requisite for our work is personal godliness. Without that, though I have the tongues of men and angels, I am harsh and discordant as sounding brass, monstrous and unmusical as a tinkling cymbal." Discussing salvation by grace, he said, "When a person runs into the arms of God, it is not the running that makes him safe, but it is the arms to which he runs." Alexander MacLaren lived a rather long life. He continued pastoring until 1902 when he was 76 years old and maintained the title of Pastor Emeritus for 8 years following. He continued dictating his expositions until well into 1909. By that time, he had only one living daughter, as well as his son, Alistair. They were living with him when he went upstairs on the evening of the 16th of April, 1910. He was very weak at that time, and after that day, he never again left his bed. On Thursday, the 5th of May, 1910, Alexander MacLaren died peacefully in his bed at the age of 84. On the 8th of May, his body was taken to Union Chapel to lay in state overnight in preparation for his funeral on the 9th. His hand-picked successor at Union, J.E. Roberts, gave an address. As he left no definitive instructions as to his remains, his children had him cremated and then the ashes interred at Brooklands Cemetery, where his wife and 2 other daughters were already buried. Over his grave, a cross was erected which bore the Latin phrase, "In Christo, in pace, in spe," meaning in Christ, in peace, in hope. There are at least 3 full-length biographies written on Dr. MacLaren. The most easily accessible is Dr. MacLaren of Manchester, a sketch by E.T. MacLaren, a close family member. The other two are Alexander MacLaren, D.D., The Man and His Message by John Charles Carlyle, and The Life of Alexander MacLaren by David Williamson. There's also a rather good article on him in the Review and Expositor by James Stewart from 1911, as well as another in Princes of the Church by W. Robertson Nicoll from 1921. Despite having published nothing prior to the age of 36, Alexander MacLaren died having published at least 50 books, most preeminently his Expositions of the Holy Scripture, which spans over 7,000 pages and contains 1,526 of his sermons. If you'd like to know more about his published works, E.T. MacLaren devotes an entire chapter to them in her biography of him. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Baptist Directory. I'm Dr. Michael Schultz, and I'll see you guys next time.